Welcome to House of Horrors. Some sins never fade, some souls never rest, and some curses last forever. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones. This is the Sin Eater's Curse. Now, let's begin. The Sin Eater's Curse. The church was silent. So silent that even my own breathing felt like a sin. The face of Christ, depicted in the stained glass window, looked down at me with a solemn expression, illuminated by the dim light filtering through. Father Jonathan stood behind the pulpit, holding an old Bible in his hands. Beside him, a man knelt with his face covered. Surrounding them, 4 other priests stood in a circle, hands raised to the heavens, murmuring prayers in Latin. The ritual of the Sin Eater, it was the church's deepest, darkest secret, a forbidden tradition to cleanse the sins of the dead. But this was no holy act, it was a doorway to hell. Father Jonathan took a deep breath and opened the Bible. Dominus vobiscum et spiritus meus recede. The kneeling man trembled. The weight of countless sins was being placed upon him. The memories of those who had died without confession were pouring into his soul. For a moment, the shaking stopped. Everyone held their breath. Then the man screamed. But this was no human scream. His eyes turned white, his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and from his throat came a voice in a language no man should be able to speak. Benedictus qui venit in nomen Domini. Father Jonathan's voice wavered. The man's body convulsed violently, his spine bending backward at an unnatural angle. His bones cracked like breaking branches. Then the church doors burst open. A cold wind rushed inside, the candle flames flickered, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. The church was filled with whispers. My name is Father Michael. I am 45 years old and have spent most of my life serving as a priest at St. Augustine's Church. But even as a priest, you don't always understand the ways of God, especially when you witness the curse of the Sin Eater. It all started 3 days ago. That night, an old man came to the church, asking to confess his sins. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. Clasping his trembling hands together, he whispered, I have committed a sin, but it is not the sin of a man. It is a curse. The dim candlelight flickered in the confession booth, casting shifting shadows across his gaunt face. A curse? I asked. The old man nodded. I am the last Sin Eater. A chill crawled up my spine. I consumed sins, but one of them came back to me. His voice trembled. The one who carried that sin is here, inside this church. At that moment, the wooden walls of the confessional creaked, and from inside the small booth I heard another breath, but it did not belong to either of us. The old man gripped my arm. Father, you must help me. His voice was hoarse, as if something was lodged in his throat. His eyes were wide with terror, his body trembling. The breathing sound from inside the confessional grew deeper. ... I held my breath. Slowly I reached out and touched the wooden door. I pushed it open. There was no one inside, and yet a dark stain had burned itself into the wood, as if something unholy had been sitting there. The old man's voice was barely a whisper. Years ago, a dying man begged for confession, but his sins were unforgivable. And yet, the ritual was performed. His soul entered me, and now I hear him. At that moment, the church bells rang, but it was past midnight. No one rang the bells at this hour. The old man, his eyes now bloodshot, turned to me. His lips quivered as he barely managed to whisper, "Run." Then his eyes turned completely white. I wanted to scream, but the shadows inside the church began to move, and then the doors burst open once more. The sound of the church bells echoed like a death omen. It was deep, dreadful, and sent a chill through my entire body. At that moment, the old man's trembling body suddenly convulsed. His eyes rolled back, turning completely white, and a deep, inhuman growl escaped his throat. "IT has awakened." His voice was a mixture of a whisper and a scream. Then, his body lifted off the ground. It was as if invisible hands were pulling him upward. His fingernails scratched against the wooden floor, leaving behind streaks of blood, but there was nothing holding him. The entire church became ice cold, and that was when I realized we were not alone. Something else was in the church, and it was taking him. A ragged breath escaped the old man's lips. Then his voice stopped completely. His body hovered in the air, his face twisted upward in agony. And then I saw the shadow in the bell tower. A figure stood in the church's bell tower, but this was no ordinary man. Its body was crooked, as if its bones had grown incorrectly. Its arms were unnaturally long, its head completely bald, and its eyes black, empty voids. It stood there, motionless, and then it slowly turned its head toward me, ... and it smiled. That thing saw me. At that moment, the old man suddenly dropped to the floor. His body was lifeless. His face had turned completely black, his eyes hollowed out, as if all the life inside him had been drained. The creature remained in the bell tower, silent, but I could feel it calling me ... Then, suddenly, the bells tolled again, and from the darkness, the sound of distant screams filled the church. I collapsed onto my knees, my chest tightening as if a heavy weight had been placed upon me. Then something stirred within the pews. One shadow rose, then another, then another. Figures began standing from the darkness. Their eyes were pitch black, their skin decayed, and their elongated hands dangled unnaturally. The church was now a place of the dead. A whisper slithered through the air. "Confess." My lips trembled. They wanted me. I took a step back, but my feet lifted off the ground. I was being pulled. I shut my eyes. I tried to pray, but only empty sounds escaped my lips. "Pater Noster, qui es in celis," Our Father, who art in heaven. But inside me another voice was speaking, not a prayer but a curse. And at that moment, the church doors opened once more. From outside, a powerful wind rushed in. But with the wind, something else entered. A priest, but a man without a face. He wore an old, tattered robe, his face completely smooth, just blank, empty skin. He did not speak, but suddenly every creature in the church dropped to their knees, as if they worshipped him. Then the church bells rang one last time, and when I blinked, I was no longer in the church. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the church. Darkness stretched endlessly around me. There were no walls, no ceiling, only the void. But I was not alone. Footsteps echoed in the silence. I took a step forward, but I couldn't even feel the ground beneath me. It was as if I was walking on nothing. Then the church bells tolled once again, and something appeared before me. The faceless man, His robe fluttered slightly. He did not speak, yet I understood what he wanted. You are in the Sin Eater's domain. His voice was not spoken aloud, but rather echoed inside my mind. By coming here, you have set it free, and now it will devour your sins. At that moment, something moved within the darkness. A shadow emerged from the void, but it was no ordinary shadow. Its entire body swirled like living smoke, and from its form endless screams echoed. Something inside me was being pulled away. It was as if my soul was being ripped from my body. And the thing, it was walking toward me. I shut my eyes tightly. I tried to pray, but my voice would not come out. Then I heard whispers in Latin. I knew that voice. Dominus vobiscum et spiritus meus recede. It was Father Jonathan's voice. He was calling for me, ... But how? He was already dead, and suddenly everything began to tremble. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the church floor. Father Jonathan was standing over me, clutching a Bible. He was shaking, "Get up, Michael. You shouldn't be here." But the figure in the bell tower was still there, and now it was fully awake. Its eyes were fixed upon me. And then the bells rang one final time. I tried to run, but the church doors wouldn't open. Father Jonathan grabbed my shoulder. "Listen to me. If you want to escape, you must leave your sins behind." What did he mean? Then I understood. This place only trapped those who carried the weight of their sins, and I had been carrying too much. Every dark memory I had buried had drawn me into this curse, and I realized they would not let me leave. But someone had to go, and Jonathan, he smiled. "Forgive me, son," and he pushed me toward the door. One last toll of the bell rang out, and everything was consumed by darkness. When I opened my eyes, the sun was rising. I was outside the church, but inside there was no one. The doors were sealed, and the bell tower had collapsed. But I knew one thing: something was still there, and it was waiting for someone new to consume. Some stories don't end here. Some curses last forever. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and turn on notifications for more horror tales. And next time, make sure you're not alone in the dark. Good night from House of Horrors.